homophobic, xenophobic, Islamophobic, you name it. He has given voice to some of those folks, and they are irredeemable, and they are not America. And now her contender is not without saying other deeply offensive things, like she is a nasty woman, clearly attacking her policies. Very thoughtfully there. And then he says, oh, Hillary wants to essentially abolish the Second Amendment. By the way, if she gets the pick, there's nothing you can do about it. Although maybe you Second Amendment people can. So the question becomes, well, how has this happened? How have we gone from saying, okay, if my guy wins or if my guy loses, I still hope that person does a good job, to I hope he fails, maybe kill the opponent. Like the conversation that we're having in politics nowadays is just completely changed and devolved in these very nasty ways. So you could also make the argument, and some people do, they say, oh, well, you're just cherry picking these anecdotes, and really we're not any worse or polarized or more hostile than we've been at any point in time, except for maybe in the 1950s. So I can summarize some data in a couple graphs here. One, we can look at how far apart the Democrats and Republicans in Congress were over time. So generally, they're in the late 19th century, they were pretty divided. Like this is more than in the World War II period. And then since World War II, that has ticked up again. But one thing that is really emerging is that this is growing rapidly, and we're more polarized now than we've been at any point since we started computing this, since we had both parties as they exist in 1856. So this is striking. The division that we see in Congress and in the Senate is unprecedented. But you say, okay, well, maybe the politicians, they're just becoming nastier, and that might have nothing to do with you and me. We're all still good people. We're not that divided. We can look at individuals' attitudes towards their own party versus other parties and see, okay, is that changing over time? Now, in social psychology, where that's my field of expertise, we have this general finding: we like people in our group more than we like people in other groups. Hence, logically, why we choose the groups that we're in. So here, this is a common measure in political science and in psychology of liking for somebody else, or liking for members of another group. So higher numbers mean you like people in that group more. Lower numbers mean you dislike them. We sometimes call it feeling thermometer. So here we see in the blue line, that's Democrats. Democrats like Democrats more than they like Republicans. Republicans like Republicans more than they like Republicans. And that doesn't really change from Carter or Reagan or Bush 1. But over time, we see that this polarization is increasing, where members of both parties have much more negative views of people in the other party. But their views toward their own party have basically stayed the same. And before, they were kind of around the midpoint. So we're saying, they're okay. They're not great. They're not terrible, but they're okay. Now, we're basically seeing that we really dislike people in the other party, actively dislike people in the other party. And I'm not including Trump here because technically the affective polarization decreased, but only because, liking of all candidates, regardless of what party they're in, went down. So this, which liking for the other party went from like 10 to 0, basically. And liking of the Democratic Party among Democrats dropped about 20 points. Liking for Republicans among Republicans dropped about 20 points. Both parties, and this makes sense because both parties nominated the least popular candidate that was running for president. So there's still this antipathy towards the other party, but there's also some displeasure with each party's own candidate. So this is some data suggesting that the elites that we have, our representatives, are more polarized, and some evidence that we ourselves are also polarizing as an American public. Okay, that probably isn't a shocker to you. Academics argue about it, but I don't think most Americans probably do. So that's probably not that surprising. But the more interesting and maybe important question is, well, why is this happening? Why are we more polarized now than we were, say, prior to the Civil War? That's, to me, that is insane. One of the arguments that people make is that it has something to do with this growing outrage culture, this outrage media. So we are always publicizing the horse race. And indeed, there's certainly a lot of evidence suggesting that when you talk about the horse race and my team winning and the other team losing and all the ridiculous things both sides are doing, or either side is doing, you entrench people in those positions. You make them more and more hostile towards the other side, and people get more excited about it. And we get ourselves worked up. And when we're so emotional processing this political information, we become more and more biased in the stuff that we're seeing. So we see MSNBC berating Trump. We see Fox News berating Hillary, whatever it is that we're watching, that it just fuels this cycle. And as it goes on, as we are exposed to more and more of this media, we become more and more extreme in our views there. Other people point to the rise of massive influxes of money in politics and super PACs with Citizens United, and the amount of money that has increased in federal elections in just the past few cycles is dramatic. Like the candidates, they used to accept public financing. Now they're saying, no, screw that. I can raise way more in micro donations online. I can do a whole lot more in micro targeting with my Facebook ads and my Twitter ads. And they raise billions as opposed to limiting themselves to, I think it was like $64 million in the 2008 election, which was what they would get from public financing. So you become beholden, presumably, to the logic is that you become beholden to these big donors. You say, oh, if I'm an oil tycoon and I give you a donation of $1 million, you might want to think about, building that pipeline. And that's a reasonable inference to draw. Some people even make the argument that it's inequality that is causing this rising incivility. And this is the most tenuous claim, I think, at least the way that we're assessing it so far, because inequality, as measured by the Gini index, it just looks at the top earners versus the lowest earners, that is something that's been increasing over time. So anything else that's been increasing over time, like, I don't know, for resales or use of computers, that's all going to correlate too. So we can't really disentangle, well, is it inequality that's causing this, or is it just one thing that's also increasing at the same time as this other thing? So some people make this argument, and I think all of these are probably related, but I think that there's something more fundamental that's happening. And I think it has to do with the way that our society is shifting. So where we choose to live, who we affiliate with, and one way that we can look at this is looking where people in different political parties or people with different political beliefs are living, and are they shifting into different types of communities. Now, you kind of think of those stereotypical like red and blue maps that are usually at the state level saying, oh, at least 50% plus one person in that state voted the Republican or Democratic, and that's not really useful in trying to understand this segregation, because it could really just be 50% plus one person because we have a first past the post majority system within the states. But if you look at the proportion of communities that are landslide districts, so this is where the candidates would win by 20 percentage points or more, and we look at this map from 1976, the areas shaded in blue are places where the Democrat won by more than 20 points. So landslide districts, heavily Democratic areas. Areas in red are places where Republicans won by more than 20 points. But most Americans lived in these other areas. About 80% of Americans lived in a competitive district. So these were places that were 50, 51, 49, or 55, 45. They're close. So these are integrated, heterogeneous communities where people actually interact with people who hold different political beliefs or belong to different political parties. Now, if we fast forward to 2012, we now see that 16% of Americans live in a competitive district. So over this time period, people have selectively migrated into communities where they're surrounded by increasingly similar people. So what this means is, yes, Jane.
Did the, I would assume that maybe the more blue people are the ones that migrated and the red people stayed. Is that right? Is there any, are the migrations distant, like the amount of distance each? Does that make sense?
Yeah, that's a good question. Oftentimes, in different studies that I've run, sometimes it looks like Republicans do this more, sometimes it looks like Democrats do it more. And the answer is not really clear. Okay. America is one of the most residentially mobile places in the world, so Republicans are just as likely as Democrats to get a job offer somewhere else, and then they move to that place. And when you move, you have a lot of degrees of freedom to where within that community you move. So if you get a job in Chicago, you could choose to live in some neighborhoods that are very liberal, or maybe out in a suburb, or somewhere up north, or in Indiana, and you'll be choosing a neighborhood or a community that is more congenial with your particular beliefs. Okay. And when we have these increasingly segregated communities, these people have very different life experiences, increasingly different life experiences as these communities kind of pull apart. So you see that things like the types of cars people drive are different. The proportion of hybrid cars on the road in communities is a really good predictor of how democratic that community is. Same thing with the ratio of bookstores to gun stores. You can predict how Republican or how democratic a community is from that. And the types of churches, obviously, more evangelical Protestant places tend to be more conservative. Places that have more New Age churches, like atheist churches or Unitarian Universalist churches, much more liberal. And even these subtle cues on our vehicles, like does the bus say Merry Christmas or does it say Happy Holidays? Good predictor of the politics of the place. And even television ratings. Duck Dynasty is insanely popular in the south of the United States and in many conservative states. But Modern Family is not. Modern Family is really popular in bigger cities. And you can see this in music preferences. You can see this across all sorts of different domains in life. So these communities are very different places. And these are not political issues. These are just lifestyle issues. And if you look at the more political stuff, you see, okay, you have Starbucks saying, oh, guns are not welcome here. But if you go to Texas, you have this restaurant saying, gun-carrying customers get a discount at the barbecue restaurant. And if you look closely, it says, firearms welcome. Please keep all weapons holstered unless need arises. In such case, judicious marksmanship is appreciated. So the people living in these communities have wildly different experiences. And I think that this is actually a really helpful way to think about political conflicts and arguments, because there are, with these different experiences that we have, we might see different political issues. So in the wake of the Great Recession in 2007, 2008, the communities where conservatives were primarily living, places that are more rural, lots of mom and pop places, mom and pop, small business kind of stores, and farms, military towns, unemployment wasn't really affected that much. Might have went from 4 or 5% to 6%. It's not a big issue there. But in liberal places where there's more industrial jobs and corporate jobs, you see that unemployment might have went from 5% to 30% in some places, 35% in some places. So when you have the liberals or Democrats saying, hey, we need to extend unemployment benefits, and the conservatives are like, what are you talking about? I don't know anybody that's unemployed. We need to extend farm subsidies. We need to help small businesses. And the liberals are like, what are you talking about? Everybody I know is unemployed. So both sides have a valid political concern there. They're not crazy. They're not just making it up. They have a valid concern. This is not to say both sides always have a valid point. But in that particular example, I think they do. And this segregation isn't just geographic. We can see it in Congress. We can see it in our social network. So here, this is an analysis of Twitter that I've done where you look at people so you can estimate what their politics are. And then you can see the things that they talk about and who they talk about those things with. In red, you have conservatives. In blue, you have liberals. And I can't see a single red dot over here. There's one or two blue dots over here. But essentially, we talk politics with people that agree with us. And oftentimes, when we're talking about politics, we're complaining about the other side and how angry they make us. But at no point do we actually have any interaction with them. So we're getting ourselves all worked up by ourselves. It's us doing it to ourselves. So this has this tendency to create this sense of an echo chamber where people are constantly reinforcing your beliefs, and when nobody challenges your beliefs, there's this tendency to polarize. So in some famous studies, we see that as people talk to people who are similar to them, they move apart on those political issues. Now, one other extension of this that was highlighted in a conversation with Jim Leach, he says, it becomes much easier to say nasty things about people when you don't know or when you don't have to face their families over the dinner table. So we reasoned, okay, well, does this also apply to our attitudes towards those people, regardless of who you are, what your politics are? And indeed, that is what we found. So the more we are segregated, the more we talk to people that are similar to us, the more we dislike people that are dissimilar from us. All right, so womp womp. What on earth can we do? This is terrifying, this is depressing. And yes, I know I wake up every day and have that exact thought. But fortunately, I spent way too long studying social psychology, and social psychology has long been motivated to understand intergroup conflict and ways that we can promote better relations between groups. Now, in famous Robbers Cave experiment, they had children from all over the country brought together in a camp in Oklahoma, and then they had these kids, they didn't know each other. Some were in one cabin, and then some were kind of far off in a different cabin and campsite. And they became like in groups with each other, and then they were introduced to each other. And these groups did not get along very well. They fought basically instantly, even though they were randomly assigned to these groups. There's no real basis for it. They're just random. But in these cases, the researchers were able to try different interventions because the captive audience, and they found some things like creating superordinate goals. So shared goals among all of the campers, like, oh, if they want to rent a movie, they have to share their pool, their money. And then in those cases, they were able to set aside their differences for a short while to actually get that desirable outcome. So there's a lot that we learned from those types of experiments. And one of the things that happens when you bring these camps together, especially under very specific conditions where they can have informal conversations and they're not allowed to throw food at each other. That happened a lot when they initially brought them together. They start forming relationships. When you form relationships with people that are different from you, in different groups from you, it becomes a whole lot harder to be nasty towards them. So we wanted to try to see if we could integrate people by forcing them to interact with people that are different. And with civil politics, we work with a lot of community organizations that they just ordinarily bring these groups of people together to promote some kind of dialogue on some locally contentious issue. And some of them, they let us collect data. So in this case, we were able to look at how hostile people are before and after this event. Not ideal quasi-experiment, but we had a good number of people. We got to know their political beliefs. We asked them, how likely are you to yell at somebody over politics in the next couple of years? And then we also measured what we're calling identity polarization. And these are paired statements. Things like, America would be a better place if all liberals or all conservatives packed up and moved out. Now, these are pretty extreme, and then we look at the gap between them. If I am a liberal and I say, America's a whole lot better if all those conservatives pack up and move out, and I say, no way, America would be way worse if all liberals packed up and moved out, I would be very polarized. But if you're not polarized, you should say, no, we need both. And there shouldn't be a difference between those questions. And what we found is that after the conversations, people became less hostile towards people on the other side, and they even showed a slight decrease in their self-reported likelihood of yelling at somebody over politics in the next few years. So it's not perfect, but it's a start. So it's promising if we promote relationships that can potentially counteract this segregation that we've been building over the last few decades. All right, so integration, we're currently trying to figure out, like, how can we scale this? Because these are just like random community organizations all over the country that approach us, and not random, not representative, there are issues there. And then how long lasting are these interventions? Because if it lasts for an hour, that's good, but really? Like, it should last for much longer than that, because we have to live in this world with these people. So I realize right now you might be saying, but I want to fix this quagmire now. Maybe just me? No, maybe her too. Solidarity. So fortunately, I have some evidence-based interim solutions here. And I'll say that it starts with us. We should vote. And when we vote, we should be thinking about the candidates that we're voting for, not just if they agree with us, but if they seem like respectful people. And are they hyper-partisans? Are they refusing to compromise with people on the other side? Because if they are, then it's just going to prolong and extend this problem, maybe exacerbate it. Yeah?
I got a question. I mean, a lot of voters in our country aren't that educated or that knowledgeable. Oh, all right. Can you guys hear me? I'm sorry, I just had a quick question. A lot of the voters in our country aren't that educated, so I think at times that kind of skews the results. So I'm just curious to see what your thoughts are. I mean, I know actually Bill and I were talking about this. Everyone wants people to come out and vote. It's a really nice, like, galvanizing and positive thing to think about, but unfortunately, sometimes the results aren't all that conducive, and so I'm just curious to see what your thoughts are on that.
Yeah. So, of course, that's a complicated issue because, well, we should. Like, there's a lot of argument about whether we should have compulsory voting, and oftentimes the response is, well, voters don't know what they're voting for. But if you look at the political knowledge of voters versus non-voters, it's often not different. So non-voters, like, some of them know a whole lot, and they just say, there's no difference between the parties, this election doesn't matter, or I live in Illinois, and the Democrat's going to win regardless. And then they don't vote. So it doesn't seem that political knowledge necessarily differentiates the voters and non-voters. But we have plenty of voters that vote kind of randomly. And oh my goodness. When I first learned some of these findings, like, the position of the candidate's name on the ballot can explain up to 7% of their vote in some places. So in the past, we just had the names listed alphabetically in most states. But now some states are randomizing the order of the names to try to address this. Because, like, the order, like, if you I'm always screwed because my last name's M. I'm always in the middle. But anybody that has an A or a B, like a Bush or a Clinton, they have an advantage over, say, the Romneys or the Trumps. But the Trump example is good because it's not everything, but those little things, they can matter a whole lot in these close elections.
And I don't think it's unique to us as Americans either.
Yeah, no, it's true.
In the UK, they had the same thing. People, after the Brexit situation, people were like, most Google thing was like, what is Brexit exactly?
Yeah.
So,
yeah. Most voters, regardless of where we are, most people, we try to do what's easiest. And we often have other priorities. Like, most of us have jobs that are not related to politics. Most of us have families and these kinds of things, and we spend a lot of time caring for those, and not as much time trying to study up on the 1,000 pages of whatever policy is being debated at the time. So it becomes really hard to be politically aware of everything. So it's not easy. I think here had the first hand, and then that.
I was just going to say that there's kind of like an assumption there that it's always better when people who are more educated vote, and that sounds like it makes a lot of sense. But on the other hand, everybody feels stuff, and a lot of voters, I would say, vote with feelings versus, and we've just seen a couple places where maybe those passions didn't get everyone exactly where they wanted to be, but there's a lot of parts of the world and parts of America, I think, that when people do feel a certain way about their families and their needs, and that's valid. And I don't know, I think that's a really interesting conversation to have.
Yeah, I agree. And I don't know what the answer is, but it's challenging. What do we?
Yeah, no, it is challenging. It's
And some people, the founding fathers, some of them were using that as an argument to not give universal suffrage, because we don't want people that aren't landowners to be able to vote. We don't want people that are not educated to vote. And then some people use that as kind of justification for basically Jim Crow laws. You have to pass a test before you're allowed to vote.
If the smartest people were the only ones who voted, they would eventually use that to their advantage and stay in that spot. So there's just a weird balance there.
It's like the Divergent movie.
Well, I was going to ask, you're saying smart, educated. I'm thinking that, and then I have another question. Smart meaning, do you understand that there's 3 pillars of government? They've done these quizzes where people can only name 1 or 2, but they know all the Kardashians. So when I think smart, that we're not politically, we don't know how our government runs. So we can have people react to Obama's going to take your guns. Well, hold on, he can say that. Politically, can he? Is he allowed to do that legally? So there's that. My question to you though is did you find any evidence that of politicians enjoying this divide and gaming the system to the special interest groups and have the media, the Rush Limbaugh, say these things to further divide us because they benefit from it?
Yeah. So this is part of another cultural shift that has happened over the last really since 1994 when they changed the congressional schedule, because it used to be that our political representatives, they would move their families to DC. They would have a house or a condo or apartment there, and they would be there 3 weeks a month, or they would be there most of the time, and they would interact with each other. But in '94, we shifted away from that. So now they fly in on Tuesday, they vote, they have their caucuses, they do whatever they need to, and then they leave on Thursday. So they don't really interact with each other, they don't live there, they go back to their districts. And even now when they're elected and they go to the orientations of how to cast a ballot or where to print your papers or whatever, that kind of non-political basic logistical stuff, they have it separate. So Representative Henry Cuellar, he's a Democrat from Texas, and he was walking in the first day when he was elected, and he gets on the bus, and the bus gets silent. And he's like, oh, what did I do? He said, you're a Democrat. Your bus is over there. So they're not even allowed to interact with each other in that way. And that, of course, fuels the division. But the other cultural change, institutional change, that happened in 1994 was we changed the way that we assigned committee chairmanships. So instead of giving it to the most senior person, which is what we'd done basically the entire history of our country, we shifted it to giving it to the representative or senator who'd raised the most money for the party. And now what we see is that both parties thrive off of kind of this drama. And when you had, I can't remember, the representative or the candidate that was in Missouri who said, oh, women, when they get raped, they could shut that thing down. And that's a horrible thing to say. There's no medical basis. It's just ridiculous. And yet, in the next 24 hours, he was using that as fundraising propaganda. And he raised millions of dollars. And Claire McCaskill, challenging him, also raised millions of dollars in that same time point. So the more ridiculous things that they say, it helps both sides. So people start jumping in and helping candidates on both sides. The person that said or did the ridiculous thing and the person opposing that person. And this is becoming more and more common on both sides. So they're fueling off of it. And like, we get worked into our friends. We're like, oh my goodness, this guy is immoral, he's ridiculous, he's dumb, whatever. And then we start throwing money at his opposition. But it's also exciting to his people, like, oh yeah, that's how it works. But I mean, that goes back to the political knowledge issue, or medical knowledge issue too, in some cases. But yeah, it's bad. So like one thing we could change is, I'll say here, is we can rebuild those cross-party relationships by changing the congressional calendar so that they're there in Washington more often, and we remove some of that pressure to constantly be raising money. Because now, when they're spending 3 days a week in DC and 4 in their districts, what they're doing every day, they spend most of their time just on the phone trying to raise money. Question?
So, I mean, honestly, with voting, we've seen more, honestly, with Brexit, and then honestly here, where I think there's a lot of people that like, oh yeah, I'm going to vote, but then it comes a day, it's like, oh, I don't want to wait in line, so I'm just, who cares? Like, especially this election, I think everyone thought Hillary is going to still win, even though with the scandal and all, they thought, okay, there's no way this guy's, and I think a lot of them just stayed at home. They're like, I don't want to wait in line. Like, honestly, we can't put it online, right? Because that's like, how do you track that? That can easily be manipulated, right? But have you heard of any new ways? I mean, honestly, there's gerrymandering that's happening too, but like new ways, techniques that people are talking about as far as making it easier for people to vote? Because it does seem like, for me, I knew how important the election was, so I was willing to get up at 6 o'clock in the morning, wait in line and do all that. But I know there's a lot of people, especially younger generation, they're so used to just being on their phones. They're like, can I just do it on my phone? But it's like, that's not going to happen. Well, I think that elder generation, it was similar, I think, to Brexit, where I especially saw in Ohio, where I grew up. I mean, honestly, they're retired, so they honestly have the time to go. They're fine waiting in line and voting while, younger people like have jobs or whatever. And they're so used to just how things are. I mean, I don't know if you've heard of any discussions about how ideas as far as how to improve it to make it kind of as far as easier, but still be able to track it where it's not, people can't rig an election or anything like that.
Yeah,
so I was just curious about if you've heard any ideas.
One of the approaches that's been used a lot, but was curtailed a little bit this last time, was early voting. So if you extend voting out 2 weeks, you're giving more and more people the opportunity to vote, because especially low-income people, they might have to work 2 jobs. And if they work 16 hours on election day, that might encompass the entire time when they could potentially vote. And we don't have a national holiday, which some countries have, on election day, so those people aren't getting the day off. Their bosses might not give them time off. So like, those are some of the things that have been discussed, like having a holiday, or getting like permission, like setting it up so that workplaces have to give you some time to go vote on that day. But I don't think a lot of those are very serious discussions.
Yeah, I mean, I know like early voting, but I don't think even a lot of people even probably know about that. I mean, honestly, we know, but honestly, I think people from like overall probably know even what's the process of going and doing that. I think that hasn't been really clearly communicated,
Yeah.
but I didn't know if there was like other ways as far as ideas people have been thinking about, going forward. But
Yeah, I mean, one thing that has been done, but it's been done unevenly, is like having more and more precincts. So if your precinct is easy, if it's a block away and you can go there very easily, then people will do that. But this past election and past couple of elections, really, there's been complaints about, okay, well, some communities are getting more precincts and voting locations than others, and this happens to coincide with, say, socioeconomic status of the community or racial makeup of the community, where white communities, older communities, they have more polling places than non-white communities or poorer communities. So, like, that's giving some people a greater access to the polls than other people, and those other people are people that probably need more access because they're probably working longer hours and having a harder time getting to the polls.
So I agree with you that voting is important, but I also know that in the minds of the politicians, not all voters are equal. And what I mean by that is the more money you donate, the more access you get to politicians, and the more actively they try to recruit you and want you to be not only part of their campaign, but to have an ongoing relationship. It means that you as the voter can get your views across more easily, or your agenda. So is there a way to change that? Because clearly money matters in politics. That's why they're raising billions and billions of dollars. So obviously that affects who they're targeting, because they don't have to have everyone vote for them. They have to have the right people and the right crowd vote for them.
Right, and one of the arguments that is made in support of public financing of campaigns is exactly for that reason. So if we check that box on our tax returns and we all donate whatever $3 or whatever it is to campaign financing, then they're not the candidates aren't beholden to anybody. But with super PACs and just the massive amount of money that's now involved in politics on all sides, it's not in a candidate's best interest to do that, because then they're going to be outraised by 20-fold probably.
I just wanted to jump back real quick to voter education, and I'm not so curious about, whether someone's educated or not in their voting, but the quality of that education, because I think, I guess my question is, have you noticed any correlation between someone who votes conservative and their family votes conservative and they watch Fox News all the time? And, so I'm kind of wondering, even if someone claims I'm a really educated person and I'm voting, maybe they're only educated because they're consuming a particular type of media or information source that has been manipulated or is not unbiased in any way. So I'm just wondering if you had found any correlation.
Oh, certainly, yeah.
With something like that.
Absolutely. We all self-select media, and with the internet and then the rise of cable news, we can choose whatever station or whatever website or blog confirms our beliefs, and we come to think, oh yeah, of course, InfoWars, not at all biased. Fox News, oh, that's not biased. MSNBC is not biased.
Has there been anything, I guess, then put together to, or any talks about some sort of ethical way of conducting policy and political campaigns? I mean, is there something in the works? Because this is just, with the insanity of the internet and illegitimacy of so many different sources and propaganda, I mean, it just seems like it's a different world. And, people can spout crazy, ridiculous, evil, incorrect information that influences a voter. And I feel like voters consider themselves educated when perhaps they're not, because they're consuming just false information. So what does that regulation look like? How do we fix that?
Yeah, and that's a really hard question, especially with a free market, because it's like, well, there's a lot of subjectivity with most policies. Like, okay, if we're talking about abortion, well, when does life begin? And people make arguments of all different, like at conception, like after you make a boom, like that's when it happens. Or, oh, it has to be first trimester, second trimester, like there's no correct medical answer. So when that's the case, somebody would have to stand there and say, okay, this is indeed the fact. But in most cases, I don't think that there is a clear-cut fact. So how do we I don't think we as a people would ever be comfortable with there being a decider saying, this is what's fact or not. There are some things that are easier, like anthropogenic climate change. That, yes, basically all scientists that do this, 99.7% of them say, yes, there is an anthropogenic effect. But most things are not that clear-cut. He's been trying to ask a question for a while.
I think you're missing the largest point that leads to the polarization. Your vote matters in my life. In 1896, your vote for the president didn't really matter in my life, right? Mm-hmm. So we can sit here and talk about all these superfluous factors. The bottom line is, when your party wins, my life has changed significantly. When my party wins, your life has changed significantly. So, I think there's two ways to conduct or to combat that. One, the federal government doesn't have that much power over my life, right? And then California can California, Texas can Texas, right? And everybody's happy, right? You know?
Yeah. So I'm curious how much we're actually affected by who wins the presidency, because.
Yeah, wait, is that perception or reality that you're talking about? Like,
Oh, I mean, so look,
I
so
feel like
here's
it's
the biggest
perception
indicator,
that
right?
affects that,
The biggest
but
indicator is,
reality-
in 1896, what was the spending on elections? It was nearly nothing, because people spend money on elections because there's to be gained. There's something to be gained by
But what
gaming the
if,
system
maybe-
or
maybe, like,
influencing.
making them realize it really doesn't. I don't know.
Well,
I
actually,
see
it was
what
more,
you're saying.
it
I
was
just-
more game back then. just
Yeah,
back when
yeah, I was.
Well, it might have been game, but I'm talking about like political spending.
But people.
it
Because
wasn't-
more people have a stake in the game.
Exactly.
What is that
So
based
if you-
on is the question.
If you want
I don't
happiness
think
to
it
go
really
up and
matters.
if you want happiness to go up and polarization to go down, you allow people to have choice, right? You buy a Samsung phone, I buy an Apple phone, like, hey, cool dude, whatever you want to do. The problem is, I can't buy this party or you can't buy that party because there's a winner and a loser every single time. And the government has so much influence in all of our lives that it really does matter and it pisses everybody off.
Well, hold on, because I was told how horrible my life was under the Obama presidency. Although my income went up, my taxes were the same. So I didn't realize how miserable my life was until somebody told me. So is it a perception? Even under Trump, all the hard, everything with that, my life actually is better.
Right.
But it's not because of him. So that's where my question before of gaming the system, because I'm in power and I'm making my thing here. If your life is good for you, bad, I don't care. I don't think, that's what I'm thinking now, and the government politicians really don't care. They have their world.
Sports team more than anything.
Yeah, I think.
Does your life really matter if your sports team is winning? Like,
The polarization actually brings them further apart, so we can't get anything done, so it affects our lives none.
Well, you're right,
I
in
think
the
that
long term,
the
like
checks and
infrastructure,
balances,
yeah.
they're checking each other. Trump gets everything overruled in federal courts before he can do it. And, I mean, these politicians are so far apart that they can't get anything done to make our lives better, so our lives stay the same, and they're fine right now. I mean, pending Trump, pending he doesn't say something stupid.
People spending billions
Give
of
him
dollars
thought.
not for them to maintain that polarization, because they have to maintain their agenda.
Yeah.
And there's millions of
Which
money
is the
being made
problem.
on talk radio and talk
They
TV.
would not spend the money politically if it didn't have an effect. So, if you want the money, not, what's that?
Are you talking about the disintegration of the federal government?
No, I'm talking about like,
About like every state kind of having a free-for-all.
That's how it's supposed to be. Federalism
So
was like-
That's what they want.
federalism is supposed to be like very limited central government, and then like the states can do whatever they want, right? That's what the Constitution says. And that way, like, everybody wins, right? I can move here, you can move here, and we all live our lives.
But Kansas is an example of that failing.
But what failing? There is no failure when there's 50 different choices and they can either.
Well, they chose to defund less government, and their school system is down, their taxes are diminished, they have no income, businesses are shot.
Well, why do you care?
Why do I
Kansas
care?
loses.
I went to the University of Kansas.
But I mean, that's the beautiful part, is Kansas can lose, and California can kick butt, and everyone can be like, oh, well, let's all move to California then, and
Because
let's
I
try
have an
that.
element of humanism. And I don't want, as in nationalism with Americans, and I don't want to say, because some knucklehead made a decision that millions suffer.
why do you care so much about that?
Yeah, it's-
Like, that doesn't, like,
So-
why waste that?
So what that means
energy
to me
on
is,
other
you
people?
need to tell me how to live my life, right? And I would rather you just live yours and like I live mine.
Then that's libertarianism, which sounds good, but doesn't work.
I think it worked here for like, 175
That was libertarian.
years. The United States, Hong Kong, Singapore, I mean, these are all libertarian places. The United States it was an extremely limited federal government.
I think that the thing that you guys are talking about, though,
It made us the richest country in the history of the world.
I think it does exist out there a little bit, because one of the things I think we might have seen in this last election was the anger at both parties, right? And kind of what shook out of it from was whether for us in this room, like, yeah, life's great, you know, like our income goes up, you know, no matter which administration. But for a lot of people out there, it wasn't. And whether it was Obama or George W. or whoever else, their lives weren't getting any better. And I think that what we saw here was an expression of that anger. So I think the dynamic that you guys are talking about probably exists. But I guess the question then is how do we deal with that?
So beyond voting.
One last thing on voting. There's been a lot of discussion about making voting require like a requirement, like a legal, like as a citizen you have to vote. What are your thoughts on that?
It's complicated. Well, I mean, it goes back to questions of like, well, do voters know what they're voting for, and do
caveat that by, you know, unlike other countries, the United States still allows legally to run campaigns that are negative on the other candidates. That's not allowed in the majority of democratic countries. Not all, but most. So, like, we could limit a lot of, what I'm saying, make it required, but like make people legally stand for what they stand for. Like on this issue, this is where I stand, so that people aren't going into trying to figure out what's fake, what's real, what's, well, you know, what I mean. So.
Well, anything else of those countries, which, I mean, honestly, you have points, like, they also have to universal health care as well, which they also, that's like completely different, just like our way of thought is like so different from there. It makes sense. Like, you look at even gun control, like, you know, I remember watching, even stand-up comedy, Jim Jeffries was talking about how there was a mass shooting in Australia, and they're like, no more guns for you, and they're like, okay. And then they took away guns, there hasn't been mass shooting, but like here, it's so complicated, right? Because everyone's like, my gun rights, just because they always give this reason for, you know, if the government comes after me, I need to protect myself. You know? Which, I mean, there's some cases there are. I'm not trying to say which one's right or not, but it's definitely more powerful. We're kind of like in this middle ground where.
Well, some the politicians in Australia, what they did is they had a backbone. A lot of them lost their position, and that's one thing. Because like with Jim Jeffries, they also talked about that wouldn't happen here. You would not have a politician give up his career.
Yeah.
Hence, where I was saying we're playing the game, and also kind of leaning to what do you think the odds of overturning Citizens United, which probably is a tale to a lot of the things you look at.
I don't think the Supreme Court will do that, at least with its current composition. But it probably won't even get to the court again for a long time. So.
It's a limit on free speech. I hope they wouldn't.
So corporations have feelings too.
Well, corporations technically are people too.
So that's what they're saying, but they have more money than you and I, and they can actually screw us both because they're looking at their own interest and not ours.
And that's why I would go to the core of the problem, which is don't make it as important for them to spend money, right? I don't want the corporation spending money either, but I'm not going to put a law down that says they can't express themselves and use their money. It's their money. And if you limit the amount of money that go into politics, well, then you're just going to have all the money's going to go to media companies so that they can do their own politicizing. I mean, their money is always going to be there. You can't just get rid of it.
But they used to have their own editorial.
It's the power. So you limit the power, you limit the money.
So one of the potential remedies is not to eliminate the money, but the way that campaign finance is supposed to be working is, okay, super PACs are not supposed to be affiliated with the candidates. So you can have a super PAC with a certain motivation, and maybe they prefer one candidate or not, but they can't be coordinating with the campaign. Right now, they are coordinating.
Who cares? Why? Why does it matter, you know?
Because all that money goes into everything that influences a voter, whether it's false advertising, marketing.
It's all going to be there. It's all going to be there. They're going to spend the money. They're going to spend the money. You can do all these rules and regulations. They're going to spend the money, and they're going to get a message out there. It doesn't matter what you do, and you're just going to limit some people's free speech and not others. Why not just allow all the free speech? But if you don't want to live under a thing you don't believe in, then fight to not have so much power controlling you.
Free speech also includes hate speech and other very detrimental things to society as a whole, to the country, to everything that America stands on, diversity and
America stands
inclusion.
only on free speech.
Hold on, but you're missing something. When and I served in the military and I had to deal with this crap too. Free speech, yes, but you accept the responsibility of that.
Yes.
So if I stand up here and yell fire and you panic, that's my free speech. You didn't have one. But, and should I be blamed for that? Should I be blamed if I say racial things and somebody dies for that? Should I accept responsibility for that? So you're saying free speech, but I say you have to have accept the responsibility. You just can't say anything you want and get away with it. You have to be able to, if there's a group that disagrees with you, you have to accept that responsibility. What I see now is I have free speech, I can say whatever I want, and you can't. And hold on, you have to be able to also accept that responsibility. You do have an opinion. And we don't do that. Or we don't accept the responsibility when we say whatever we want, and if somebody dies, we don't care. Because it's my free speech. I think we're distorting a little bit with the free speech.
Yeah, I'm gonna fight for free speech.
No, I am, but I'm not saying not. I'm saying, but accept the
I think
responsibility.
there has to be responsibility. I mean, I'm not saying
And
there
there's
should be
been a
a
court
war,
battle over saying fire, and I will agree with that court decision, but I mean, saying something that's gonna offend you, or, you're not gonna agree with it.
Yes, for fire, but gay, spick, nigger, whatever, no. So people
Yeah,
can
no,
say-
I'm
it's
gonna
really
say
things
you can
there
say whatever you want.
Right, so you think that's fine, and then, but, if you push someone too far, you shouldn't accept the risk, like if you provoke,
No,
you're free
because
speech.
you
I
can't like
shouldn't,
hurt me, that's not protected
you don't-
by
but
the
you don't-
Constitution.
what
My
is that?
speech is physical, if you're gonna like,
Free speech is, but I'm saying, you're going constitutional, I'm going accepting you as a citizen, accepting the responsibility of what you said. I think a lot of people are gaming that now with the racism, whatever, because I can say whatever I want, because now it's not politically correct, which is the thing that kept bringing up in the snowflakes and all. So now I can say all the hateful things that I felt repressed. But they don't want the responsibility. They don't, when the media goes against or the crowds go against, now you have our president, they're bad dudes on both sides. Hold on.
I don't know what general responsibility.
Of accepting when you say something that someone may get angry and go against you.
Yes.
So if you say
I'm
something,
prepared for people to be,
okay, good, but there's a lot who aren't and are
Yeah.
angered.
they're not protected.
Do you guys mind if I can ask?
Yes, please.
Getting back to we've got the first two about fewer hyper-partisans and weaker pressure to act partisan. It's kind of like, how do you empower the moderates, right? How do you kind of get a lot of the passion on the wings, right? We see the most passionate television, the most passionate arguments from the wings. How do you do some of that, empowering the moderates?
Yeah, so it's tricky, and there are a number of nonprofits and political action committees around the country that are working to do some of these things. So the Centrist Project is one, and they've received $20 million in donations. And what they're doing is they're trying to, their goal is to win 5 Senate seats. Because if you have 5 Senate seats of people that are moderate and they have to be persuaded to vote with you, nothing can get done without those 5 people. And it's really expensive to win a Senate seat. So I don't think that they'll actually work at the federal level, but they're starting at some local races in some states that are more amenable to moderates. So I think that there are some places like that. And people with that are well connected, well to do, like Michael Bloomberg, people like him, even though he's a special case, would have the ability to fund a campaign like that. Not to say he is moderate, but he was somebody with a lot of money. They could probably do it themselves. And any moderate that has to be recruited to vote with somebody or one of the teams hoping for a majority is going to have outsized power, because sometimes you just need that one extra vote. You just need John McCain to sign off. You just need that one person, and if you get it, you win. If you don't, you lose. So it's a weird way to think about democracy, because it should be the plurality of people, but oftentimes it's just a couple people that are in the middle. Yeah.
How about the primary? I was going to say the primaries, but
Just directionally, obviously there's an identity crisis in America. We have the left, we have the right, and we're just not getting along, whether it's in this room, whether it's in Congress. You just go look across at the state level, federal, is it gonna get worse before it gets better, in the sense that it will take the crisis to get us together and have like, I'm just wondering, just in your opinion, or based on what you've seen statistically, is it gonna have to get worse into, like, the last time Abraham Lincoln got us all together, we had the United States, we had the North and South, we came together as one United States. He had to put the Union together, and then we stood for something, and then his secondary thing was to free the slaves, but he wanted to unify us first, because otherwise he couldn't accomplish that. So is it going to take another crisis to bring us together? I mean, is that really the doomsday?
Yeah, and so and when we look historically, we see that incivility and polarization are lowest right after crises. So think of World War II and parts of the Cold War, like polarization was down, incivility was down. And then right after 9/11, there was bipartisanship, there was compromise, there was less hostility for a short while. One example is President Bush's approval rating the 2 days before 9/11 was like 53%, and the week after, 90%. So Americans set aside some of their differences and said, okay, let's rally around the flag, let's rally around the president, let's try to deal with this threat. But eventually we get to this point where we're arguing about details. So we forget about the superordinate threat. We say, oh, he misled us into Iraq, he did this, he did that, and then we were more polarized than we were before that. But these kind of shared threats, these big threats that affect all of us, do have a tendency to bring us together. So yes, but I mean, hopefully that's not the only way that we can resolve this.
What direction are we headed in? Are we gonna get more polarized, or we're waiting for Civil War?
Yeah, I don't know about Civil War.
Maybe climate change. I don't know. Or I live in,
But I do think it's going to get worse.
it's gonna get worse.
I think it'll get worse, and at some point, things will break. we play this brinksmanship game where we're all surprised when we passed the budget, and it was like a few weeks before the government was going to shut down. Like, we shouldn't be proud of that. Like, this is weird. We shouldn't be doing that. So eventually, it's just going to catch up with us. Maybe we don't pass a budget. Maybe all the debtors that we're collecting money from or they're lending money to us will say, no, just pay up. We don't trust you. You're not a stable country. We don't trust you. And then we're really screwed. So something like that could cause rapid change in a positive direction, but I think it would be catastrophic. Yeah.
Well, no, I mean, it's a tough situation. I mean, I get your point about free speech. I get your point, right? I think there's, of course, I support free speech, but also you can say what you want, but there also is going to be consequences. Either people attacking or even counter your point. For me, I'm just talking about my personal experience is that, I've made mistakes, we all have, and I think the idea is just we have to constantly learn from each other, and I assume that we know everything. I'm still learning, right? But I remember in high school, this is just personal word. I remember, I'm sure most of you, we used to commonly say that for all the time. Gay slur, say fat, and all that. I said it all the time, not realizing there was probably a bunch of kids that were in the closet, and they couldn't be themselves, right? And it wasn't until I got into college, met people, interacted with them, gay students were out and stuff like that. I was like, holy shit, I can't believe I was saying that. So to the point now, I don't even say the word anymore. So I think, again, it's a tough thing. I think a lot of it is I've been blessed where I've been able to interact with a lot of different people, and I think that's the different thing is I do think it's important to just try to meet new people. I think honestly Ivy is trying to do that, right? We're trying to meet new people. I think that's where we can have conversations. This is the first time being in having a political conversation with new people, right? And I think it's great that every one of us is taking, doing this to hopefully learn something. Even if we disagree, hopefully you brought some good points. Maybe I can think about, hopefully you think about what I'm thinking about. And this is important. So I think this is things that we need to take the responsibility. I don't know exactly if the government should be totally involved as far as every single decision, then, there could be problems there. But there is some limits, right? And I think it's complex, and I'm still trying to figure it out. So I don't have all the answers, but I think by having discussions like this, helps people understand it.
Yeah.
But again, we're still I think the approach is just constantly learning. I think that's the biggest thing, and try how we can communicate better with others.
So these two have had their hands up, and I want to make sure they have a chance.
Yeah, I definitely want to touch more upon the psychological aspect of how someone's ideals affects their political identification. And since, like, going back to the study that you showed, dialogue is very important. And the question comes, is dialogue effective? Is that the only thing that we could do to, have these two polar, personas, come together in have some sort of like middle ground. To be honest, I don't think dialogue is as effective. I think it's an underlying problem, something as simple as our fundamentals, like education, diversifying our curriculum. Because I don't think someone that's, is around people with the same ideals is ever going to experience something out of the ordinary. It has to be something implemented.
Yeah, so oftentimes, especially with these discussions around police brutality, Black Lives Matter, these white supremacy events that have been happening. I mean, I lived in Charlottesville. I know two people that were friends and colleagues with the woman who was killed. So there's the radical people that are participating in both on all sides of the issue. They say this dialogue is not the answer. You should be fighting about this. And just by disposition, I don't fight with people. I just like to listen, try to understand where they're coming from, because for me at least that feels more productive. But I also understand, okay, well, sometimes if people aren't listening, then what's the point in talking? You need to force them. And that's those are two common approaches that have been applied kind of historically. And sometimes the existence of one of them helps the other one. So you think Martin Luther King and Malcolm X. So Malcolm X was supportive of violence and kind of this no dialogue, only fighting. But that made Martin Luther King that much more valid and gave him more of a voice.
I definitely think dialogue is very important, but I think it doesn't have to be an extreme measure for change to occur. It can be something as simple as implementing a subject in grammar school for their curriculum. It doesn't have to be an extreme crisis for change to occur. It's something that's, I feel like dialogue is something, I could talk to someone that has opposite views as I, but, their mentality is based off something that's ingrained in them at a very young age. You don't just come to a setting, talk to someone and your ideals change. Not at all.
Right.
I mean, I do agree to a certain degree. I do think it's like having one dialogue with somebody that's different from you and then never seeing them again. It's not going to change. I think it's something where you have to spend time with them, right? And actually find ways to be, where you find common, actually you spend time. And honestly, I have friends that are conservative and I consider them like family, right? I've been fortunate now, right? Because we found other ways where maybe politically we're different, but there's other ways where even religious reasons, but we found ways to connect in certain ways. And I think just opening yourself up to being, finding ways to be in common in certain, and we're not all just, I think that's what's sad about what you brought up before is you watch Duck Dynasty, you assume you're a Republican, all this other stuff, right? And I think it's just maybe in our own head when we think that, maybe we make those judgment calls, right? I've done that too. I assume that, a person likes that, they must be conservative, I'm not going to bother with them. But then you actually, I've met people at happy hours and I assumed that they were like this. I talk to them whoa, you're nothing like that at all. I didn't realize that about you. So I was putting my own shield up as well. So I think it's just, I agree, just having one-on-one dialogues, but I think kind of creating more, environments where, and we see this in Chicago, this is the cities are super segregated. Right? I mean, there's a wall between the south side of Chicago and here, right? And it's kind of sad, where people just live their daily lives and they're all happy, but just people probably right now getting shot and killed right now. And, a lot of people don't talk about that. And so, honestly, and I was one of the problem. It wasn't until really the election I kind of realized, hey, I want to get more involved and start experiencing, going out there and having, seeing how it is out there and going to volunteer at schools and stuff like that, just kind of opened my eyes as well. So it's tough. I mean, I don't know exactly, but I think, curriculum is definitely a good way, especially at a young age.
I disagree completely, only because I think that dialogue is more
effective if it's done in the home. I don't know if many people in America would be comfortable with their children going into schools, and the schools are the ones teaching them how to live and what to think and what to believe. I think that the change needs to come by having more dialogues and more friendships or something like that within families and parents and communities, and then having those open conversations with each other, and then families make decisions. I would not feel comfortable as a Christian person having my kid go to school and it's run by the government, and the government tells my kid that evolution is the end all be all regardless, because that's my personal belief. I believe in open dialogue and things like that, and diversity and all of these wonderful things, but I don't want the government teaching my children and my family and, stuff like that. I think it starts in the home, and I think that's the problem with some of the education systems anyway, the education system is trying to raise children without the parents. And I think the parents are absolutely struggling. Some of them aren't doing a good job, but I don't think you should compensate at early education and that, because then the government's raising your kids and you're not teaching the parents anything.
Oh, I
don't know that the changed curriculum is the right answer.
I think there obviously there's improvements in the curriculum. I'm not saying changing it. There definitely is, obviously education systems that I think it's not the greatest, right? I mean, universities are great, but they're strong. So, but I agree. I agree. There shouldn't be like this force where we're trying to force like schools should be taking care of the kids, and we shouldn't be there. But somehow, honestly, I'm still figuring it out as well, right? So I do agree that just having one dialogue here tonight and then everyone's going to be changed. No. We go back to our regular lives, and then we'll be thinking about it now, but then tomorrow we have work and we're all in busy lives, and then we go back to thinking what we think. Right?
Yeah, no, definitely not having like sets in stone curriculum, and where it's either A or B. It's more so diversifying the curriculum, where just broadening your horizon. It's not like, you have to believe in evolution and the curriculum is only going to be about evolution. It's more so like broadening your horizons. And I feel like dialogue is very important. It's just like, if you have dialogue at home with your parents and your family who have a set ideology, a set mindset, you're not really doing much.
And I think it's the job of the parents to expand their child's mind, and it's the help of the parent's mind that needs to be changed, and not the child that should be molded. And a 5-year-old given all of these different religions, for example, here, pick one, and they're 5. I don't think that that's helpful. I think that what's more helpful is having open adult dialogue so that parents are more open to understanding the world around them and introducing their kids to a diverse world around them and helping them understand, here's what we believe as a family, but there are these other things out there, and hopefully the mindset is we're respectful and we're, understanding that's not how it always goes, and it's really important.
So how would you, I just
Sorry,
a question, how would
I
you?
interrupt to ask a quick question.
No.
The book Richard Forte wrote about achieving our country, it was written 20 plus years ago. He died in 2007, but they talk about how it was foreseen that it didn't matter who the politicians were, but this is exactly where we would end up. But, can you kind of shed some light on what you think about that one?
Yeah, so anytime you have basically a two-party system, it's built to go this way.
Right.
I think our system is set up so that it does do this. And a lot of political scientists, they'll say it's operating exactly as it should.
So
It swings, yeah, so we become more and more extreme, and we have a check because it's almost impossible to get anything passed. If something is passed, then it must be necessary because, well, somehow you found agreement across the massive chasm between the two parties. But I think the social component, like me and you sitting down talking or refusing to talk, or just because you're wearing one candidate's shirt and I'm wearing another one, like the fact that we can't even have a conversation, I think that's a problem. Like the politicians, like they thrive off of conflict and yelling at each other. But if we can't see that, hey, you might be a good person even if you vote differently from me. That's a problem because our society requires that we be able to connect to each other, to talk to each other, and we're not doing that right now.
I think you brought up a really key phrase before when we're talking about like, do we limit people's rights maybe, or how do we like basically make people act good or accordingly, right? And you said the word consequences. And I agree.
I think it's more understanding personally, right? And just having those like Bible consequences. You say like, I'm not saying you said, but if you felt comfortable just saying the N-word.
Yeah, it's just important.
And I'm like, and hopefully you understand like, hey, this is happening. You hear the story, and like, I mean, there are consequences to your actions where people can use that to, lead to other actions, right? And so understanding that. Right? So I think there is that divide as far as people kind of use that as like, oh, I have no responsibility for it. But hopefully you understand personally. But I agree. There's no way you can really force that.
Yes, there is. There is a way, and it's through private exchange, right? So, in a free and open society with a private market, bad people are punished. Okay, if a company or a person at a company or a corporation or whatever does something that's heinous, or is, let's say they're discriminating, right? They don't discriminate or they don't do bad things. They don't pollute or whatever because of the fallback and the consequences of those actions. Yeah. And that's our choice essentially, right? So if Apple does something really, really stupid, well, we're just going to choose to buy Samsung, and that is such a powerful motivator that it forces good behavior. So what I would want, and I would push for, is that we have as much choice as possible, like you do at the grocery store, or choosing which grocery store you do, right? And so you only have that with a very vibrant private sector in which the government plays a very small factor. And that way, if you are a bad person, you're not going to be hired. You're not going to get promoted. You're not going to run a business. People aren't going to support your products. I want as much of that as possible.
But how do you determine then who is good and who is bad, and who decides?
It's your pocket, your wallet.
Right, so then we go back to the Wild Wild West, where you and I have a private exchange. You say something I don't like, I've now determined that you're a bad person and I shoot you in the head.
No, that's not. That's not.
That's what it sounds like.
I do see where you're going. I do see where you're going. I think honestly, I think it's certain companies, right? I do think that does help in certain ways in companies as far as diversity programs and all that. I think that is an important thing because there's people that maybe never grew up interacting with different types of people, right? But now they're kind of interacting, and that's a way where you're working. You're basically working in an environment where it's like 40, 70 hours a week, where essentially these people are just coming to your family.
Think about the fact that we love the ability to every single day vote. No, we vote with our pocketbook, right? We vote on which store we support, which state we live in, all this stuff. We get to choose. Except with the government, we choose once every 4 years or once every 6 years, and it's like a total binary choice. Yeah. That is horrible. Why do we
such
a...
How did I choose credit default swaps in a Great Recession? How did I choose?
You can put your money into an organization that makes those kind of decisions, or you can choose not to.
Okay, I'm getting a stink eye from Kyle. So I think we need to move this out into the other room where there's more booze. I need it.
We need more than that.
I think it's a little bit more complex.
We need more.